So good evening once again. We apologize for keeping you out a little longer than expected. We had technical challenges. Actually, you notice Moses is not here because he's having difficulty getting into the system. And so we are trying to adjust, but nevertheless, we will be able to continue. And when he's able to rejoin us or join us at a point, he will be able to move on. So I'm going to begin by looking at module 3. So I'll basically take care of his session until he comes. So module 3 is a model for ethical decision making. And we are going to be talking about, several models that are used to guide us in decision making. We're going to look at about 3 of them. One is by someone called Forrester, Miller, and Davis. We're going to look at a second one by Corey and Callanan. And thirdly, we're going to look at another one by White and Popovich. So we begin with the first two, and then we go to the third. So the learning objectives of this course or this module include the following. We describe 3 models for ethical decision making, like I have said. Then we shall describe ways an ethical decision making model can be useful to you and I in an SUD program. And then we're going to finally practice with a tool that can be used to guide ethical decision making. So we'll not only describe it, but we shall actually practice with it. Now, when we think about a model for ethical decision making, what are we thinking about? We are thinking about applying a model that can help us or help counselors and providers to make informed decisions. Remember, we have been saying that ethics is about standards, it's about beliefs, it's about making sure we do the best in the situations we are in. We talked about values and the 17 universal values that we mentioned, which have to do with the beliefs and attitudes about what is good and what is right and what is important. So when we think about ethics and decision making, we want to help counselors and providers make informed decisions, decisions that are anchored on the different values, the different ethical aspects. We also want to help them in resolving dilemmas, ethical dilemmas, which sometimes will go all the way into legal circles. And when we get there, we need to have the respective codes, the respective processes that we used to arrive at the decisions we made so that we can actually present our case in the court of law if that happens, or before a licensing board, because that can happen, especially in countries where practice is regulated by boards and by law. The decision-making model can also help you assess the values and principles that will be behind the choices you make. I mean, in day-to-day life, we are going to find ourselves challenged by situations that will require us to make critical decisions. Sometimes these decisions don't have a clear-cut answer. And so what will help us is using the decision-making models where we assess the values, we assess the principles, and look at the consequences of the actions, and then we arrive at the best decision that we can stand by and actually defend. Now, like I said, we have 3 models we're going to look at. The first one is the one by Forrester, Miller, and Davis. It has got a total of 7 steps. And basically what this model is about, it says that when you're faced with an ethical decision-making situation, what should you do? First and foremost, you must identify what the problem is. Now, identifying the problem might sound as easily as identifying a problem. But when you come to an actual situation, sometimes we are unable to pick what exactly is the problem because we get clouded by our emotions, we get clouded by our thoughts and perceptions and biases. We're unable to pick what really is a problem. And sometimes I like to explain this when I think about this point. You're driving to an exam.
Hello, Roy, we cannot hear.
Beatrice, are you still there? I think she may be having some connection issues. Hopefully they'll resolve in a moment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because we can't hear her again.
Okay.
Right, she has a little icon that says that she has low bandwidth right now and that it'll resume once the connection improves. Um,
I'll just call her in a minute just to see because we can't.
right, I'm messaging her here. Sorry everyone, we're having a few technical difficulties today.
No problem. We will wait.
Oh, there she is. I think. All right, well, is everyone having a good evening so far? Yeah.
Jessica, are we able to move with the slides though if she's projecting?
Um,
Or she would have to stop sharing.
I can probably make you the presenter instead. Here, let me. Is that okay? I'm gonna click make you the presenter and see if that switches it over to you.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So you have permission to share screen now.
Okay, I would have to go into the let me just go into the modules first.
I do have it if you need me to do it.
Yeah,
But
just go ahead.
just go ahead. Okay. I need to open. It's module 3, correct?
Module 3.
Okay.
Love.
All right. It's opening in a moment. Thank you for your patience, everyone. All right, and we are on. Alrighty. Where's WebEx? There it is. Okay. All right, are you able to see?
No, it's not yet.
No?
Yeah, I can see the screen. The screen which you
Oh,
are
okay,
sharing.
the screen. Okay. Yes.
It's okay, we can see. I can see it as well.
Okay, you can
Okay.
see the PowerPoint slide now?
Yeah.
All right, great. So, Marikwe, I guess just tell me when you need the next slide.
Yes. I know Beatrice was still talking about Forrester and Miller's ethical decision-making model, as she was already started. The first one, as she already stated, is to identify the problem. And then number two is to apply the appropriate code of ethics. Then the third one is to determine the nature of any dilemma that comes. Usually when there is an ethical dilemma, we are supposed to actually stop and think about where the nature of the dilemma is actually emanating from in order for us to go to the next step, which is step number 4, to generate possible course of action. We can go to the next slide. Jessica, we can go to the next slide.
Oh, I switched slides. Is it not showing?
She's already there.
Oh, mine is
Are you able to see 5 through 7
yes,
now?
mine is
Yes, 5 to
and
7.
then the next
Okay.
step, which is step number 5, you consider the possible consequences of all the options and choose a course of action. So for all the consequences, we look at the possible consequences, and then from there you choose the best course of action. After you've done that, then you evaluate the selected action and implement the course of action. We can go to the next slide.
I've switched it. I think it just takes a moment to show up on your end.
Mm-hmm. For just a few minutes, I want us to just reflect, how does this model compare with the decision-making process in your practice or program? How does Forrester and Miller's decision-making model or ethical decision-making model compare with the decision-making process in your... Before we go to Corey and Corey, yes, let's talk about, maybe let's just go back to the slides. Go back to the previous slide so that we can just remind them. I know that.
Oh, the 5 through 7?
Yes,
Okay.
because I know I'm just rushing through. The previous slide.
I think it's just taking a moment to show up.
Jessica, I think she wants 1 through 4.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Are you able to see it now?
Yes. I will then, like in our respective programs or treatment centers, obviously most of us, we identify what the problem is, right? We are able to know there is a problem. Do we always apply appropriate code of ethics? Do we even have code of ethics that we apply in our respective treatment centers or programs? Anybody?
Right. It looks like Fatima has raised her hand.
Fatima, do you have a code of ethics that you normally apply when there is a problem or when there's an ethical dilemma?
Yeah, in my organization, what we do, if there is a problem, maybe an ethical problem, we may not necessarily follow all these steps as it is here. And all the code of ethics that has been mentioned in the beginning of this course 8, most of them are not there in my organization. What we do when there is a problem and you have identified the problem, the next thing you have to report to your immediate boss. This is what we do. You know, you report the issue to your immediate boss, then you all sit together and look for a way out or how to manage the situation.
The next step, which is determine the nature of any dilemma. We know that a dilemma might emanate from a counselor working with a client. It could be maybe more of a dilemma that actually emanates from the program policy. So the next step is to actually determine the nature of the dilemma. In terms of those that do not have code of ethics, how do you then go about actually going to step number 3 and step number 4? Jessica, you can move to the next slide. For those that do not have code of ethics that they usually use when there is an ethical dilemma, what guides your resolution in terms of addressing an ethical dilemma? Jessica, we
Yeah,
can
this
go
is
to the next
Godfrey.
slide.
I
Yes.
am thinking that we may not have the code of ethics. Maybe
Mhm.
we may not have the code of ethics at our
Mhm.
table or hanging in our offices. But I think from our training, we usually
Yeah.
cover ethics, and we have some of these ethical principles in our minds.
Yeah.
So I think they are the ones we refer to in such situation.
Yes. No, and it's true, because remember yesterday we did talk that a lot of professions have code of ethics, and I know that even for us in Botswana we don't we apply the NAADAC principles, which we'll talk about later. But in a lot of instances where people do not have code of ethics that pertain to addiction profession, they use the other code of ethics from the professions that they're already in. So thank you for that. So normally you consider the possible consequences, looking at all the options that you are about to take, and then choose the best course of action. And from there, you evaluate the action after you have actually chosen the action, and you implement the course of action. So we'll move on to Corey and Corey's ethical decision making model.
Marikwe, Beatrice just messaged me that she's back, so would you like to turn it back over to her?
Fine.
No, I think she can complete that section.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yes,
I
yes.
wasn't able to respond to you since I'm sharing screen.
Thank you. She can actually
Not-
proceed and continue that section.
Yes.
All right, perfect.
So we can go to the next slide, which is Corey and Corey.
There we go.
The next one. Now, the first slide, the first one.
The 1 through 4. Okay.
Yeah. Similar to Miller's, even for Corey and Corey, you identify the problem or the dilemma, right? You need to first identify what the issue is, what is the dilemma, and then you identify the potential issues involved. It's quite similar. Review the relevant ethics codes and know the applicable laws and regulation. Here, the difference when you look at the previous one is that knowing the applicable laws and regulations is not necessarily considered, but all the time when you are faced with an ethical dilemma, you have to be cognizant of the laws and regulations in which you operate in. So these are the 4 steps with regards to Korean Callanan models of ethical decision making. It's 1, identify the problem or dilemma, identify the possible issues that are involved, review the relevant ethics code, and know the applicable laws and regulations. In terms of identifying, step number 2, identifying the potential issues involved. Issues can emanate if, let's say, maybe it's an issue that relates to sharing information or confidentiality. So there might be other possible people besides maybe the client that might be involved in that ethical dilemma. So as you try to address an ethical dilemma, you want to be more extensive in coming up with resolutions to address that ethical dilemma. You can go to the next slide so that we have time. Just okay. Number 5, obtain consultation. Very important. And I appreciate what Fatima said, that usually for them they go, which is very much encouraged, to go to your supervisor so that they are also aware of the ethical issues or ethical dilemma that we are encountering. You consider possible and probable causes for action. Evaluate the possible consequences of the various decision. You don't just want to be stuck with one decision. Take different possible decisions and see what those decisions, the possibility of the consequences of the various decisions, and choose what appears to be the best course of action. The next one. The next one. So the most important is consultation and reviewing or maybe looking at the laws and regulations that actually are in operation within the workplace that you are actually in. Now, in terms of looking at Corey and colleagues' model, how does this compare with what you normally do in your own practices or programs? Is there anything that is different? I know at times we don't have for example all the steps listed out, but I know that for example in my practice we usually go through the steps. It might not necessarily be from step 1 to all the way throughout. So I'm wondering for you colleagues, is it something that you relate to? Is it something very different in terms of what you normally do in your own practices? Lamez. If there's nobody having a comment.
I want to say something.
Yes.
There are cases where you look at the code of ethics, there is no specific guideline about the issue. And then we say the person can go do it by matter of conscience. In that case, you do whatever your conscience accepts as right, where there is no specific guideline either from your supervisor or from the code of ethics.
Okay, that is a different way of looking at things. Do what is right according to your conscience. What do others think about that? Like, and I'm guessing because you've done that, it has worked. Because normally a lot of people would say, can we then have accountability if it's going to be done by Selemope just using their own conscience, Dr. Oko? I'm assuming it has worked and it has not brought a lot of other issues with having the responsibility of one individual making a decision based on their own convictions.
It doesn't, because you do it when there is no specific rule about that particular issue.
Okay.
So somebody cannot really cite anything against you.
Okay. No, then okay. Issues of it's not illegal, it's not unethical. That's where it applies. So thank you for that, Jessica. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you.
You can take a rest.
Okay, thank you, Beatrice.
Yes, you're lucky. So I think, Jessica, you can stop sharing slide and I just share my slides. Right. Thank you, to make it easier for you. So
welcome back.
Today is just an interesting day, class. I think it's just different. It's calling for lots of resilience from everybody. Because like I said, it started with Moses not being able to, actually started with Morocco at the beginning having trouble, then she vanished. Then Moses was a computer just decided it wasn't going to light up and his phone isn't going to let him in. Now I get in and there is a power failure in my space and I try to use my mobile phone and it just refuses to log in. So it's an interesting day and Moreko was going to take the entire class. So Moreko, you're just lucky and thank you for stepping in promptly. I guess that's our spirit. So thank you for introducing those two models of Forrester Miller and Davis and the one of Corey. Now the third model we look at is called the White and Popovich model. This is a 5-question model. It was developed by White in 1993 and it's used by SUD professionals. And of course, his colleague Popovich joined him in 2001 and they enhanced it. And it has become a standard text in many programs in the United States. And it does give us a framework for making ethical decisions. I have had that input by Dr. Oko. It's a very good input. And probably when we work through this model, we shall be thinking about how we can still make an ethical decision, even when we have the kind of challenges that we may have. So what are these 5 questions? The first set of questions, or what we would call set 1 of questions, asks you to reflect on the following. When you have to make a decision in a situation, ask yourself whose interests are involved and who can get harmed by this situation, by this circumstance, by the decision you need to make or not make. Who are the potential winners and losers? What interests, if any, are in conflict? So you think through that. That is the first set of questions. Further, you need to assess the interests and vulnerabilities of multiple parties. Now, who are these multiple parties? They can be the clients and their families who are receiving our service. They can be the workers who work with us or for us. They can be the organization itself, the reputation of the organization. It can also be the field of SUD, and it can even be the entire community. So you think about who is at stake, who's vulnerable, whose interests are at risk in this situation. And you think about all those broadly. The second set of questions moves away from that and asks us to think about values. So remember, the first one was asking whose interests you have to think about and whose vulnerabilities you have to think about. So in the second set of questions, we examine the values. Are there specific values that are applicable in this situation we are in? Are they universal values? Are they cultural specific values? And then we ask ourselves, are some values in conflict in this situation? You can even take a paper and list them down, the various values that are being touched by this specific issue that you have at hand. And you can remember our 17 values that we discussed in the last class that we called universal values. But there can also be additional culture-specific values. There can be additional organization-specific values. So you put this into consideration under the second set of questions. Now, the other thing you do in still the second set of questions, you explore how widely held ethical values can be applied to determine the best course of action. So like Dr. Oko said, ethics is about the best course of action. Sometimes when you can't see any codes that can guide you and there are no laws to guide you, then you want to make the best decision, which is based on the best course of action. So think about the values that are applicable, isolate them and look at them. Find out which ones might be in conflict. Now, if some values are in conflict, then you need to ask yourself, which of these values are more important to me and to my practice in this specific situation? This is where the individual discretion comes in. So you might find that the values in conflict, there is one that is more important to you than another. Maybe for you, honesty is very important in the situation you're in. Maybe to you, protecting the best interest of the client is very important to you. And so you're ready to sacrifice any other value for the sake of that one. So you need to determine the degree of good to be achieved, or on the other hand, the degree of harm that you want to avoid. Sometimes when I think about this point, I ask myself sometimes that what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people and the least harm to the least number of people? So when I think like that and assess that, I am working within this specific model of decision making. The third set of questions moves away now from the values to ask yourself, what standards of law? So do we have any legal guidelines to guide us? Do we have any professional codes that can guide us? Do we have any organizational policies that we can look at to guide us? Do we have any experiences of historical cases that we can actually borrow from and apply? This is just like the legal field does. Sometimes you hear that a judge was determining a case and there was no precedence. There was no case like that before. But other times you hear that there was a case like that before many years in history, and they pick that to guide their decision. So this is what we are talking about. So are there standards of law? Are there professional codes that you can use? Are there organizational policies? Are there any historical lessons or practices that you can pick from? You need to analyze how established standards of professional conduct apply various things, the legal mandates, the funding guidelines. Now, this is important. And the other day, someone asked an interesting question, and I might as well bring it up now. I think it was Grace. It was about abortion. When the mother has a mental, a co-occurring disorder, the life of the mother and the child are at risk. So should there be abortion? Now, it's not a question of yes or no. It's a question of making an ethical decision. And these are some of the things you will think about. What does the law say, for example? That's what bullet 1 is about. What are the guidelines, the funding guidelines? Sometimes the person that has funded your program has certain requirements or certain values. For example, if you're funded by an organization that is pro-life, then they don't have room for abortion as an option, as opposed to pro-choice. So you have to ask yourself, what are the funding guidelines? What about the accreditation or licensing standards? What about the ethical standards of any professional associations that may be there? Do you have any codes that are documented on professional practice? What about your employment contract? Sometimes your employment contract does say certain things that you must comply with. So you must consider all this as you're thinking about making decisions with regard to an ethical decision. Now, this is just a large group reflection question which asks you, how does this model compare with decision making in your practice or program? Do you have questions or observations about this decision making model? So let's reflect on it, and I'm going to go back a little. So the first one was asking you to think about the interests and vulnerabilities of the people involved. Who are they? What are the interests? What are the vulnerabilities? The second one was to look at the values. What values are in conflict in this situation? What are the values you believe in that you think you need to adopt? And the third situation is the standards of law. So 3 key things: interests, values, and standards. And we are going to see how this was extended to other issues. But up to there, for purposes of this little activity, does anybody want to make any comment about how this model compares with what you do in your practice? Jessica, you can check whether there is anybody that has raised their hand or sent a comment in chat. Yes.
I see that Francisca has their hand raised.
Yes, Francisca. Francisca, please unmute yourself.
Or
My hand is not up. I don't know how to bring it down.
oh, okay.
No problem. No problem. Thank you.
I
Anybody
also
else?
see Dr. Oko's hand raised.
Yes, Dr. Oko.
Or I don't know if it's the same thing.
Okay, so maybe it's the same thing, but we can begin to reflect on this. When we make decisions in our programs, is there any time we make considerations of the interests and vulnerabilities of the players involved? Do we think about the values? Do we think about the standards? I think I have seen someone's hand, if that is true, or did I see wrong? Okay. Is there a hand that's raised, Jessica?
It's still Francisca.
Okay. All right. No problem. No problem.
Please.
Try to
Sorry?
figure
I want to say something.
Yes, Fatima.
Yes. You know, in my organization, it's always about it's a government organization, so it's always like you should not bring the name of the organization into disrepute, something like that. You know, so what you do, they will tell you don't bring the name of the organization into disrepute. Even if you are going somewhere else for an assignment, you will be reminded that you should, you know, don't misbehave, don't bring the name of the organization into disrepute. You know, they're always saying that. So
yes, so
I want
the standards of the organization.
Yes, yes. But also, if there are ethical issues, really, in my organization, there are no laid down standards, just like you say, or just like Morocco. But each profession has its own standards, you know, its own ethical process that can really be followed. But in my organization, it's mainly because it's government. You know, they're always talking about you not bringing the government down, don't bring the organization.
Yes. Thank you, Fatima, for that example. Very important. And at the same time, you see the government, the organization is articulating its values. But you must also remember the interests of the other players besides the organization. You must also think about your values, even as you think about the standards of the organization. I think I saw another hand that was raised, Jessica.
I see TT's hand raised.
Okay, Titi, please go ahead.
All right. Like I even share with Fatima. It was this month. I had a client, and oftentimes was always talking about suicidal. You want to commit suicide like that. So I haven't gone through this program. So I called a psychiatrist at Mayaba Psychiatric Hospital here in Nigeria, and I told her everything. I was like, madam, quickly refer this person. And my boss in Abuja, they were busy calling me that no, I should still hold on to this boy. I said, Lord have mercy. This, if anything happens, the whole thing will still fall back on me. So I quickly had to make my report and make my submission. This is my stand. This guy had to be referred to whereby he can get holistic treatment, because in our case it's only SUD that we normally treat. So I had to stand on my feet and said, no, please, you are my boss, but this is the standard. This is the standard.
Thank you very much. And looking at that situation, Titi, you can see that you went beyond the organizational standards to also consider the interests and vulnerabilities of the people at hand, the client. And you also used your values, particularly the value of beneficence, where you want to work in the best interest of the client. So thank you for that illustration. So next we want to look at, we're going to be looking at an example of an ethical decision-making tool in resource page 3. And this actually expands the first 3 points of White and Popovich by adding a few other areas. For example, it adds the issue of potential stakeholders. So besides interest, values, and standards, it asks you to examine who are the potential stakeholders in that decision you're about to make. It also separates the laws from standards, from policies and historical practices, as opposed to lumping them as one. And it also adds a place for cultural teachings. That's what we are going to see when we go to resource page 3.1. This is actually how it looks like. It's a bit small in this slide, so I hope when we go back to the other one, we'll be able to see it bigger. But you can see, it asks you whose interests are involved, who can be harmed. And we are supposed to bring down or to list down, and it has given you potential stakeholders. For example, we have clients, we have their families, we have the counselor, we have our staff members, we have the program, we have the board of directors, we have the funding agency, we have the professional field, we have the general community, we have got public safety. And for each of these, you're supposed to ask, this decision I'm about to make, this situation I'm in, who is it that can be harmed? And what is the level of harm that can happen? Is it significant? Is it moderate? Is it minimal? So if it's the client, just reflecting about what Fatima has said, Titi, sorry, this client that was at hand, how seriously can they be harmed if you did not refer? You might want to put the level here and say, maybe significantly, because I've heard you talk about suicide. What about the family members? Maybe significantly if they were to lose their loved one. What about the counselor? Even the counselor looks like they might just get sued, so they are also significantly. What about other staff members? What about the program? So you look at that and you fill in these 3 columns, and that way you're able to see what kind of harm, what kind of interest are at stake. The second one is how will the primary stakeholders involved be affected or harmed? Now, it is one thing for a stakeholder to be affected, but the level of harm. So if you think about it, if if Titi did not refer this client and something negative happened, what would be the impact on the organization? What would be the impact on the client? What would be the impact on the public safety? What about the general field of SUD? So you have to think about that. What is the impact of that harm? Then thirdly, you think about the interests. Remember, we've talked about interest as being important. So whose interests, if any, are in conflict? Now, here there was a conflict between Fatima's organization. There was a conflict between Fatima herself. There was also the interest of the client. So there's the client, there's the counselor, there's her organization. Sometimes the organization wants you to keep clients in the program because they want the money the client is paying. But when you look at it as a counselor, you realize that it is not in the interest of the client. So sometimes you differ with your superiors about that. These are the kind of conflicts we are talking about. The good thing about ethical decision making is, like Titi has said, when you make an ethical decision and you document and you can explain how you arrived at it, then it can stand even in a court of law. That's the point. Now, the other point is what universal values can be applied. Now, these are examples of values that we talked about in the last class. We talked about autonomy. We talked about beneficence. It sounded to me like that's what Titi was pursuing. We talked about competence, being knowledgeable. Thank God she said she was knowledgeable because of this class. Conscientious refusal, remember, where we talked about disobeying and ethical directives. I think in this particular situation, that's what Titi was talking about. Diligence, discretion, etc. So we think about that. And then again, we put the level of relevance. How significant? Is it significant? Is it moderate? Is it minimal? We indicate that. Then what laws, what standards, what policies and historical practices and cultural teachings can we use to guide this situation? So we look at each of them. Are there laws? Are there standards? Are there policies? Are there historical practices? Are there cultural teachings? And I would like us to reflect on the last one because we come from Africa where culture is quite pertinent. Now, this slide is really talking about you reflecting on the concept of decision-making model and asking you whether it was new to you. How do you think using a model can be helpful in your work? How might using a model enhance the process your program is using to determine ethical courses of action? So having said that, allow me to stop sharing that so that we can go to the other document in your participant manual and see whether we can have a look and try to see whether we could even try to fill up something. So the participant manual is here. It is resource page 3.1. So I hope you can see here. So this is what it looks like. So let's pick Fatima's case, and I'd like us to walk together through this document. So whom do you think you have listened to? Not Fatima, but Titi explain her case. Whom did you pick as stakeholders in that case? Yes. Who are the stakeholders in that case? Whose interests are involved? Who can be harmed? Let's pick from Titi's case, and unless if you didn't hear well and you want Titi to respond, we should be able to pick it up. So Alero, I see your hand.
The client.
The client, very good. So what level of impact do you see? Was it significant? Is the interest?
Yes, it was significant. It was suicidal.
It is significant. Thank you. So you will put client significant. Thank you very much. Any other participant? Who else was a stakeholder in that case?
I think the client's family.
Yes,
the client's
Fatima,
family.
Client's family, what level?
Is significant too because they can lose him if care is not taken.
Thank you. Ujunwa, I see your hand was raised. Who is another stakeholder?
The counselor.
The counselor was also a critical stakeholder. Thank you. Exactly. Now, Grace, and what level is the significance? What is the level of impact on the counselor?
For me as a counselor, it will be a very significant one. I don't know about
so you
Titi.
think it is significant. Thank you. Grace, you want to say something? Yes, Grace. Grace, please unmute yourself. Any other stakeholder? Yes, Grace, I see your hand.
I was looking at the center itself.
Mm-hmm. So the center itself, what level of impact?
The impact should be significant also because if they don't do, over time, people will reckon them as not being effective.
Okay, thank you very much, Grace. Any other stakeholder that is not mentioned? Please mute yourself, Grace. Thank you. Any other stakeholder that we have not identified? Any chats?
Yes, the public. I think the public too.
The public, even the public
Yes.
safety. Okay,
Yes.
and probably you might want to put the level of impact less for some of these. If your organization
Yeah.
has a board of directors, you might also want to ask yourself, are they also going to be affected? What about the funding agency, if there is any? Is it also going to be affected? So these are all considerations we make when we are filling this table for the first question about interest. Now, the second question was, how may primary stakeholders be involved or harmed? So you have said the client can be involved and can be harmed. So what kind of harm can come to the client if you make a poor decision? Yes, anybody that wants to share? Yes, Alero.
Himself, you can complete the suicide he's already talking about.
Absolutely. So the client could actually lose their life. So you can see the level of harm that is at hand. What about to the family? Yes, Titi? Titi, I see your hand.
I want to go with Hilario, because if eventually the guy committed suicide, definitely is going to cause the family, sorrow as well. So they'll be affected
So
too.
the family. Thank you very much. So loss to the family. I see, Grace, you've raised your hand. Any other primary stakeholder and how they'll be involved or harmed? Okay, Fatima, I see your hand again.
The program can be harmed too.
Mm-hmm. How will they be harmed? The program?
Yeah, because the program will be seen now as ineffective, as not be seen as is incapable, of treating a client.
That's true. Thank you very much. So if a client dies in a treatment program, the brand of that program is compromised, and that could actually mean loss of business. It could even also mean that the licensing body may decide that they want to look at that program. They could even decide to close it down. So all those are possibilities that we have to think about when we are making this decision. The third area is about interests, if any. So whose interests are in conflict here? So listening to Titi's case, whose interests were involved and which ones were in conflict? Yes, Fatima, I see your hand.
Yes, the interest of the SUD counselor herself and the interest of the organization are in conflict.
So the counselor versus the organizational interest are in conflict. Thank you. Any other that were in conflict that anybody else can pick? Sometimes it's the interest of the client vis-a-vis the interest of the organization. So if the client needs better treatment elsewhere, the organization would like to keep the client because of the money that they are paying. Again, you see there is a conflict of interest, and that puts the counselor in an awkward situation. The fourth important question is the values. So what universal values can be applied? So I want us to look at this specific table here, and let us select the values that we think can be applied in this situation. Anybody here who has picked a value?
Yes, I have picked a value. I think beneficence is one of the values that should be used here.
Beneficence. How relevant is it? Is it significant? Is it moderate? Or is it minimal?
It's very significant here because the life of the
client.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So beneficence, very significant. Thank you. I saw Alero. Yes, Alero.
Competence.
Sorry?
Competence.
Competence. Is it significant or is it moderate or minimal?
It's very significant because the counselor needs to stand her ground, saying she knows what she's doing and put the best interest of the patient forward.
And you heard the counselor say that it was because of this cause that she was able to stand her ground and argue her case. Being knowledgeable and
being more competent, yes.
and more competent. Thank you very much. Any other value that you think was important here? Maybe I can scroll down a little so that you see a few more. Yes, any other value?
Yes, conscientious refusal.
Conscientious refusal, where you disobey things that are unethical, even if they are directives.
Yes.
Was that
yes
significant, moderate, or minimal?
This case is very significant.
It is very significant. Thank you. Any other value, members, participants that you see? Yes, please speak your name so that I know who's talking.
Titi, please. Titi speaking, please.
Titi, yes, Titi.
Yes, I think from this is about being justice, to be fair, to distribute merit.
So you think justice was involved where you are being fair?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And likewise, it says the other one says we should do no harm.
Do no harm. That is non-malfeasance. Don't hurt anyone. Thank you very much. Okay. Any other value that you think was actually in place? I think I picked honesty also and candor. You know, the counselor was honest and just stood boldly for the truth and spoke it out as it was. Okay, any other hand that's raised?
There are a couple, but I think a lot of them have been there for a while. I do see a Lero's hand.
Okay. Anyone else? You may unmute yourself and speak. Okay, I think that's good enough.
Talk about discretion. Discretion.
Sorry?
I talked about discretion.
You thought about discretion.
Yes.
How was discretion applicable?
For the counselor to be able to say, no matter whatever thing, it's better I send for referral. That initiative is a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. So discretion is about balancing between confidentiality, privacy, and speaking out about information of the client. That is good. So you can think about all these, you know, what we call values. Sometimes there could be other culture-specific values which are not listed among these, but which you can add here. For example, so you might find you come from a culture where a certain value is so critical that it must be considered in making that decision. I don't know whether anybody can think of any example to share with us, but you might want to think about that. Number 5, you want to look at the laws, the standards, policies, historical practices, and cultural teachings. We have said that when this model was expanded from the initial 3 questions, one of the things that was done about values, about laws, standards, and policies, is that they were separated into standalone. So, for example, the laws are on their own. So you ask yourself, is there a law that is applicable here? Is there a standard? Is there a policy maybe of the organization? Is there a historical practice? Is there a cultural teaching? So looking at the case of Titi, can anybody tell us whether there was an applicable law or a standard or a policy of the organization? Maybe Titi, you can tell us whether there was any that was applicable. And some of the things you might want to think about. For example, are there laws that tell you that if your client is suicidal, this is where they should get treatment? Are there policies in your organization that guide you and say, if a client has a co-occurring disorder, we need to refer them to another organization where we have got psychiatric services? Do we have? It sounded like in Titi's situation, we probably didn't have. So you have to ask yourself, are there any laws that apply? Because you don't want to breach laws that could get you in jail. Are there some ethical standards of the profession that you need, again, to ensure you're protecting? That's important, because if you break them and breach them, that could have your license canceled if you're in a country that licenses practice. You also want to think about the policies of the organization. Are there some policies, maybe of government, maybe of your specific organization, maybe of your donor funding agency, that require to be taken into account? Please do take them into account. Do we have any historical cases of a similar nature, how are they handled? You need to think about that and also take into consideration that the wisdom from historical practice. Are there any cultural values or teachings that need to be taken into consideration? Sometimes we come from cultures and communities where we have very firm values that need to be considered when we make decisions. So all these are things we want to think about when we use the White and Popovich model of decision making. So if you forget everything else, please remember that White and Popovich have talked about the importance of interest, the importance of values and standards, and they have also extended it to include the issue of stakeholders, as well as divided the laws and the policies and the standards into separate things, and of course the cultural teachings and the historical situation. So I hope we can have this discussion further in the LMS to try and see how we can apply this model in our day-to-day experiences. Please, you can download this and go and try to start using it in your own setting. When you use it, you probably will arrive at a more ethical decision than you would have done if you just kept quiet and made a random decision. That's the basis of this. So thank you very much. I'll now give it up to Morekwa to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. We will move on to module 4, and I will just shortly share the slides. So we have just covered the different ethical decision models. From now on, from module 4 to module 8, we will be looking at NAADAC ethical code principles. And specifically for module 4, I know we'll cover principle 1 up to 4. For module 4 up to 8, the focus will be to review the NAADAC principles and behaviors that are addressed in each of the principles. We'll also be able to practice the ethical decision making using the NAADAC ethical principles. And most importantly, we'll also use case studies that are relevant to the specific principles that we'll be discussing. Now let's look at module 4, the learning objectives. The learning objectives that we are hoping that when we finish this module, you will be
I can't
able...
see your slide.
You can't see the slide?
No.
Sorry. Okay, let me just restart and share. Okay, share. Are we able to see it?
Yes,
Are
I
we
can
able
see it now.
You are able to see it? Okay. Good.
Yes.
So what I said still stands about module 4 and NAADAC ethical principles. We are just moving on to the learning objectives. The first one is to hopefully that we are all able, when we finish with the module, to provide an overview of principle 1, which is the counseling relationship. We'll use the information that we've garnered about what the principle entails to make ethical decision making using a case study that is relevant to the specific principle of principle 1. We are hoping that you will also be able to provide an overview of principle 2, which is confidentiality and privileged communication. In the same breath, use a process of ethical decision making with a case study that is relevant to the principle of confidentiality and privileged communication. Moving right along, to provide an overview of principle 3, which is professional responsibilities and workplace standards. Use a process of ethical decision making with a case study relevant to principle 3, professional responsibility and workplace standards. Provide an overview of principle 4. So we have a lot to be learning. Principle 4, working in a culturally diverse world. And then using the same information to make ethical decision making with a case that is relevant to that principle. Now, having said that, let's now look at NAADAC's code introduction. There are a few key points with regard to NAADAC ethics code introduction. The first one is that NAADAC recognizes that addiction professionals live and work in many diverse communities. And this statement actually is reflected by our training. We as addiction professionals in this training, we work in many diverse communities. Some of us work in universities, some work in rehabilitation centers, and we live obviously from very different geographical locations. And that recognition is actually a testament of what we are doing right now. Important is that because of that recognition, its ethical code reflects best practices and the universal aspect of ethical behavior. It's important to note that NAADAC actually its foundation is from the US, but what stands out in terms of its ethical code is that it reflects best practices and it also recognizes universal aspects of ethical behavior. And so we are hoping that as we discuss, you'll see the universal aspects that we talk of in terms of ethical behavior. The other key point is that the code itself is designed as a statement of the values of the profession and is a guide for making clinical decisions. Yesterday, when we were discussing, I know Beatrice took us in terms of discussing the definition of code of ethics. There was a clear definition from White and Popovit that they have to be very explicit. The same is true with the code for NAADAC. It's a statement, it's there for people to see. And it also carries this issue of values that we've been discussing even right now, just before with Beatrice, and even yesterday, that a code of ethics actually is beliefs and values. So even with NAADAC, these are values that govern the profession. And most importantly, they also act as a guide for making clinical decisions or making ethical decisions. NAADAC also recognizes and encourages the notion that personal and professional ethics cannot be dealt with as separate domains. Yesterday, I did mention when we are talking about what Popovit and White state with regards to assumptions that SUD professionals say, that the personal and professional ethics cannot be dealt as separate domains. And I would want one of the participants to just clarify why this is very important, that we need to recognize that personal and professional ethics are not separate. Why can they not be dealt as separate domains? Just one person to share with us or why they think this recognition is very important, that personal and professional ethics cannot be dealt as separate domains. Jessica, is there anybody with their hand up?
Yes, I think some of them might be from earlier, but I do see TT's hand raised.
Okay, Titi, you can go ahead.
Sorry, I'm not used to this thing. I didn't raise my hand up, please.
Oh, okay, it must be from before then. How about Dr. Oko?
Yes, Dr. Oku, you can go ahead. Why is it important for us to understand that personal ethics and professional ethics cannot be dealt with as separate domains?
You see, as a practitioner, we're supposed to internalize the professional ethics. Because of your convictions about them, they become personal and part and parcel of you.
Yes.
So you don't separate the two.
Thank you. And also, because yesterday we talked about how sometimes personal ethics might actually conflict with professional ethics, and therefore they cannot be dealt as separate domains, just to avoid that conflict that might arise if it's actually a separate domains. The other key point, according to, with NAADAC Code of Ethics, is that the ability to do good is based on an underlying concern for the well-being of others. that when we do good, it's because we understand and we have a concern for the well-being of others. Even that is very true in terms of when we deal with our clients, that we do good because we have a concern for their well-being. This recognition, the recognition that we are all stakeholders in each other's lives. As we've already noted, I know that this is not White and Popovich's ethical decision making, but there is a recognition that we are all connected, that we are stakeholders in each other's lives, and the well-being of each is intimately bound to the well-being of all. I always think of a situation where if you are a person and you are happy and among very unhappy people, it's going to be very difficult to express your happiness. So your happiness is actually connected to the people that are around you. For you to actually enjoy that happiness, you need to be around people that can actually appreciate and let you to be happy. So clearly, we are connected. Our well-being is intimately bound to the well-being of all. When the happiness of some is based on the unhappiness of others, obviously there is going to be disaster. One's happiness can never be based on the unhappiness of others. And so that is one of the key points of NAADAC. The other one, which is very important, is that addiction professionals must act in such a way that they would have no embarrassment if their behavior become a matter of public knowledge. This actually connects to the issue of why personal ethics, it should not be considered as separate from professional ethics. And it does seem that for such a statement, we have a huge responsibility as addiction professionals, that we should act in a way that is congruent with what we do within our profession. We should have no difficulty defending that, or they should have no difficulty defending their action before any competent authority. I would want to hear what you think of this key point by NAADAC. That you should act in such a way that you would not be embarrassed if your behavior becomes a matter of public knowledge.
Alera has just raised her hand.
Yeah, go ahead.
You just said the word, it is congruent. Your personal and professional beliefs should go together. So that means it's expected that you're doing what you should be proud of, both as a person and as part of your profession. And in that way, you will not be afraid to defend your actions. You should be confident to say, I did this because this is what my profession entails and this is what I stand for also.
I know that there are some colleagues sometimes where you people would say work is work and life is life. I've left that at the workplace. This is not the workplace. But in terms of the key points for NAADAC, their understanding is that we should, as addiction professionals, behave in such a way that there's not so much of a conflict or embarrassment if our behavior becomes public knowledge. And therefore, there is that extension in terms of what we do as professionals. So you cannot be empathic in the counseling room and not be somebody different when you are in the public domain, right? You cannot be somebody that is honest or has these universal values in one area of your life, and then in other areas you do not hold the same in terms of the values, for example. So those are the key points with regards to NAADAC ethics or code of ethics. We'll move along to just highlight what the principles are. NAADAC code of ethics is actually just 9 principles, and these 9 principles actually provide a framework in terms of ethical decision making. Principle 1 is the counseling relationship. You will see as we discuss further what it entails. There are a lot of issues that are actually addressed in the counseling relationship principle. And then principle 2 focuses on confidentiality and privileged communication. Principle 3 focuses on professional responsibilities and workplace standards. Principle 4 focuses on working in a culturally diverse world. And Principle 5 focuses on assessment and evaluation and interpretation. Principle 4 focuses on e-therapy, e-supervision, and social media. This principle is actually very interesting in that since Corona, a lot of people have actually been providing therapy using digital media, and therefore it's more relevant to think right now actually to be talking about it, more especially that a lot of times in our programs we've not been using digital media to actually provide therapy nor supervision, right? And then the next principle focuses on supervision and consultation. Resolving ethical concerns is Principle 8. And the last principle for NAADAC Code of Ethics is research and publication. So we will not move on to the principle. I know we finished because my content was not a lot. We do have a lot of time to actually just discuss and just go over what we've talked about today in terms of questions. We could actually have questions and discussions with regards to the models that we talked about earlier on, and the key points for NAADAC, because basically that was my presentation. Any questions, comments?
I have a question.
Yes.
And the question is directed to Dr. Beatrice.
Okay, you can
Yes,
go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, the question is from course 7. I sent it on the LMS and it was answered. You know, when we were talking about suicide and we're talking about direct and indirect signs, one of the direct signs for suicide is sharing of properties. And when we were dealing with this case of Anil and I've forgotten, Anil and the wife, two of them, they said they went to the doctor and they said it's good for them to do their will. So when I was writing about the direct signs for suicide, I added that, well, they went to the doctor, they wanted to do their will, but I put in brackets that, well, I don't know whether sharing of will should be a sign of suicide, because at any point in anybody's life, you may want to do a will, you know. So I sent that question on the LMS, but it was not answered. So I was looking for an opportunity to ask about it.
That's a wonderful question. Do we have any reactions from the class about that question? So what Fatima is asking is, people do write their wills as part of day-to-day life, and particularly depending on cultures, by the way. It's not in every culture that writing a will is a standard practice. In some of cultures, it is not even expected, but it's getting more and more adopted in many cultures. So what Fatima is asking, because Nadia and Anil had written their will recently, and we said that one of the direct signs is actually saying goodbye, you know, doing like handing over, all right, things. Is that Anil and Nadia a sign of suicide, a direct sign of suicide risk? So that's the question. Anybody who wants to respond or to react to that question before I comment?
This is Michael.
Yes, Michael.
Yes, I want to say, in the case she referred to, it was, of course, not isolated. There were other behavioral activities that joined that will writing, which they communicated to the doctor. Because ordinarily, if somebody makes a will independent of other factors, every other thing is okay. That's the difference. So in this other case, there are other factors around the particular client suggestive of the fact that they are showing direct signs of suicide. It was not independently occurring. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michael. So what Michael is emphasizing is the contextual factors. What was the context in which this writing of the will was happening? I think that's the point he has articulated very well. So it is not random. It is within a bigger context of other realities that are happening to this family, which are also linked to suicidal risk. Thank you very much, Michael, for that. Any other observation from a participant? Okay, another way to think about it, if someone has a gun, it does not necessarily mean that it is a suicide risk. However, if someone has suicide risk factors and recently acquires a gun, then that context makes and connect that acquisition of the gun with suicide risk. So I think the point that's been emphasized here is, off and on its own, the writing of the will may be very neutral, may not have any significance. But when it's by a person or a couple that has many other suicide risk factors around them, including the loss of the son, which happened recently, and there's heavy drinking from the part of the spouse, there is recklessness in driving, and to the point that the wife has said they will not want the children of their daughter, I think, or son in the car that's being driven by this person. So now when you put all that together, that's when you classify that writing of the will as a potential risk factor. But if it was in a novel situation which does not have any other factors around it, then you would just assume the neutral activities. So thank you for those insights. And that's the way we can look at it. Okay, thank you. Morekwa?
Thank you for the question. Any questions regarding ethical decision-making models? I know we've not started talking in details about NAADAC's principles, which we will start off tomorrow. Any questions, or maybe probably something that you want to share with us participants and facilitators with regard to your own experience in your programs regarding ethical dilemmas and how you dealt with them? Nobody has experienced ethical dilemmas that they would want to share.
Hello, Titi. I think I want to share this. I could remember. Yes. Am I on?
Yes.
All right. I do remember I lost one of my clients that I confided in me that he has a child and he doesn't want his people to know, you know. So after he passed on, this element was like, how will his family know that he has a child outside? But since he said, because issue of confidentiality, you know, so I am just helpless. I cannot share with his because he told me that he doesn't want them to know. Even me, I don't even know the woman. I don't know those child, but he said he has a child. You know.
So, like for you, in terms of, because I know that when we talked about Corey, we said we have to determine what the nature of the dilemma is. What would you say was the nature of the dilemma?
For example, his parents, they're not together. The father is in abroad. The mom left them when they were very young. So it was like, it's his word that if he never is going to die anyway, you know. It was after he was discharged and learned that, you know, he relapsed again and he would left Lagos for Onitsha. Later, the father called me that he has passed on. So it was like, when he settled, that's when he settled. He was able to tell his people, but unfortunately, he didn't settle till he passed on. So.
Yes, there are a lot of factors that we have to look at in terms of determining whether something is a dilemma, whether it's a problem, and what is it that we actually look at to say that it's an ethical dilemma, and for who? Was it an ethical dilemma for you? Who's involved? Because it does seem that you were sort of holding kind of a secret for this man, and the issue of confidentiality and privileged information definitely comes into being, right? TT, is that TT?
Yes.
So thank you for sharing. I see Grace has written fear. I don't know whether the fear you are responding to what TT has just shared with us, or is it ethical dilemma relating to fear?
I was just thinking the fear of not letting his people to know, maybe based on the culture that you're supposed to be married before you begin to raise children. So based on that, if we're looking at it from the ethical principle of confidentiality, it's okay. But when you look at the cultural aspect of it, people might just be lamenting that, even if he's having a child for us, it would have been better now so that we used to remember him, which is our African culture. At that particular point in time, she should have been able to say, this is what he told me. I don't know.
Hmm. What do others think?
Yeah, fear. The context to which he said they should not let them know is because of that fear of rejection or maybe being isolated from the family culture or value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm glad that we are discussing this because clearly, as I've noted in terms of NAADAC as key point, the fact that personal ethics and personal values are not so different cannot be actually separated from professional ethics. You can see that at times even our own values in terms of what is supposed to be a family sometimes sort of actually gets into the way, because I'm getting also that sense that your own values or your own cultural beliefs also can get into the way of making something more of an ethical dilemma when we think about the professional side of it. So thank you. If there are no other examples or questions regarding, I know I want us to focus more on ethical
Hello.
decision making because that is the module that we are in.
I have a
We-
question.
Okay.
Maybe Gato wants to say
I have a
something.
question.
Hello.
Egato?
Yeah.
Yes.
This matter Titi raised. This is a Higato talking.
Yes,
A
thank you.
matter Titi raised. I don't think we have rested the matter properly.
Mm-hmm.
Now she has said that the patient, told her something.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the patient was not expecting he was going to pass on the way it happened, the way he passed on, or the time he passed on.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty sure somewhere in the future, the patient would have told his family about the child. Fortunately, the patient passed on. I'm just wondering, because I don't know now what our conclusion became. What would not have been proper, for Titi to tell the family that, oh, this your son or child who has passed on, this is what he has told me. I don't know. We didn't don't know what our conclusion is now, because to my understanding, I don't think it would have been unethical for Titi to tell the patient the disease their family, because if you told the deceased family was going to be harmed and body, if anything, people will be advantaged, or she would have done the value of she would have done good. So I want us to properly, uh, place tell us what Titi would have done. Thank you.
I appreciate the fact that you are also laughing. Of course, there are a lot of factors that one has to consider. I also appreciate that, Professor Egito, you are listening in terms of the Popovit, who is actually harmed, who are the stakeholders. In terms of determining the right course of action, I think we need more information in terms of, because for me to say this is something that should have been done. This is something that should have not been done. We could look at different possibilities and the different consequences that come up or maybe relate to the actions that you are probably thinking that we should be taking. And so probably we can do that as homework and probably also comment on the LMS just so that we get feedback, what Titi could have done, what you could have advised if you were a supervisor, right? So we can take the conversation to the LMS, and I'm glad that you want us to continue in that, because at times when people are faced with ethical dilemmas, we tend maybe to leave things unattended, and therefore I do appreciate you saying that let's take it up and discuss it more further.
Because, hello? Good evening. Because I am also thinking he may not have been having a child outside. I'm Kennedy. It may have been the client confiling in the counselor that probably he has he bought so parcel of land somewhere. He never knew he would die, but for now I've not told my family, or I have so amount in so bank, but for now I've not told my family, and I don't want you to tell them for now, not knowing that death will come soon. So in such a scenario, eventually the person dies. Will you keep quiet for such properties that would obviously benefit the family, and say you will not open up to the family? So it's actually probably an individualized case. I think we should think about it.
No, thank you, Professor Kennedy. Yes, I think it's a good case study, because I know Beatrice had said that we should be coming with case studies. It's a good case study in terms of just thinking about the models of ethical decision making, and hopefully we can also look at the NAADAC principles, what to apply and which ones actually apply in this instance. You can see that I want us to actually, or the answers should come from the participants rather than myself. So with that being said, I hope that the discussion will continue so that we can see how that could be resolved. I'm just reading Dr. Beatrice's comment here. So Jessica, I don't know whether there's anything that you would want to add, any announcements for us, Jessica?
I don't have any announcements, but I do want to thank everyone for being understanding as we dealt with our technical issues today. You guys are great and very good at being adaptable.
Yes. No,
thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Jessica. Dr. Beatrice, do you have any announcements?
Just to echo the thanks for being there and also stepping in for us with Moses. Our spirit as trainers in this course, being there for each other and resilient no matter what. So thank you and have a great night, participants and trainers, and Jessica.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you for your contribution. I hope that will continue in the LMS as I see the comments, and thank you for your patience, as already said, with regards to the technical difficulties that we experienced today. So good night.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.